welcome to the June 29, 2022 City Council Work Session. Thank you for joining us today in a fully virtual format that we're using both to respond to COVID and to the current circumstances around the City Hall, which we're all safe. Thank you. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And again, thank you all for Zooming in today. And with that, we will turn it directly over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. We have one topic today, and it's really to talk about our street bonds. So we have a number of people here that are going to give you some information and are here to answer questions. And we'll start with our Public Works Director, Matt Rodriguez.
Well, good afternoon, Mayor and Council. We're happy to be here to talk about this topic with you and to have the full 90 minutes. Let me go ahead and get the PowerPoint presentation brought up, so bear with me. Is that showing up for everyone?
Looks great.
All right. All right. Well, again, thank you for having us today to talk about the street bond measure and the potential to put a new one on the November 8th election coming up. As I said, I'm Matt Rodriguez, the Public Works Director for the city. We're going to take some time today to dig a little bit deeper into a few items concerning the bond, the systems need overview, some outreach that we've done to inform a potential bond measure for your consideration, polling report, some staff recommendations for street bond scenarios and next steps and schedule. Okay, so some information on system needs and a bit of history on the 3 previous street bond measures we've passed. Our current pavement preservation backlog is 87.6 million, down from our high of 171 million in 2007. Of the 87.6 million backlog, approximately 70 million or 80% is local streets. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. While we've historically focused on the backlog as the most important number when we talk about stewardship of our street system, our staff team leading this work is learning that it may be better to really focus on what the annual need is to address pavement preservation needs and what the overall condition index of our street system is to really inform how we invest in the future. We currently estimate an annual need of 15.5 million to keep streets from becoming reconstructs and to repair all reconstructs we currently have within 10 years. And that would be a gold standard if we could get there, but it's something to keep in mind when we have this conversation. We currently get about 2.9 million a year in local fuel taxes for preservation of the street system. So as we talk through the bond measure and apportionment of funds, it's good to keep in mind what can the bond do to close the gap between 2.9 million a year and the 15.5 million need. All right, so now we get the fun of some graphs. So this shows the pavement backlog over time. I know there's a lot going on here. And what the backlog could have been if the community had not supported a series of bond measures to fix streets. It also starts to show how we've outperformed the funding we have received in the past. So if you can see my cursor, we go back to 2008, that's kind of the origin point for where we could have diverged and the initial bond measure investment. So in 2008, we passed a $35.9 million bond measure. That accounted for about 6.8 million each year to address the funding need on top of the funding we already had. And honestly, that fuel tax has stayed pretty steady at 3 million all the way back since I can remember. So I think that was probably about the same in 2008. We passed another bond measure in 2012 that was 43 million. That dedicated about 8 million a year to pavement preservation. And our current bond measure passed in 2017 and that added 9.2 million a year for pavement preservation. So this line in orange, which was projected in 2007, it really only projected out to 2016, and it said, hey, if we don't do something, we're going to be at 282 million by then. We've been able to project this out a little bit more, just kind of using that same compounding increase to really give us an idea of how much we've reduced the backlog compared to what it could have been. And actually to also talk about how we've outperformed our investment. So if you think about all those investments we've had since the first bond measure, that's been about an additional 110 million to today. We still have some in the 2017 bond measure still to invest in the system. And we've gotten about a $290 million reduction. So really great performance for the investment we've had in our community. And you might ask why, hey, how have we outperformed with that investment so much? And I think it really boils down to three things. We have a significant number of streets that were built with what we call deep lift asphalt when they were originally built, a lot in the 60s and 70s. This was kind of a gift from the folks that were, building streets back then. And often from the surface, these streets look like reconstructs. When we go and rate them, we do that visually. But when we come back and test them and actually do a project, we find out really they only need the top layer of asphalt removed, so that significantly can reduce costs. Secondly, we're really surgical in the way we rehabilitate streets, meaning we look for areas of good pavements to save, and we make sure we're constructing our pavement sections to match the needs of the street, so that can reduce costs compared to what's estimated. And third, we benefited from really competitive project pricing in the early days of the bond measure as we were coming out of the recession. That's not necessarily true now, but we've been able to really benefit from that. One second, let's see. Ooh, I didn't know I animated this slide. Let me move all the way through it. I was wondering why some things didn't show up. That's the full glory of it if you want to see it, a little more busy. Okay, let's take a little deeper look at the current payment backlog across street types. As I mentioned previously, you can see that our arterial and collector streets, which are here, are performing really well, and that's due to the investments that we've had from the bond measure. And you can also see that our residential streets are the bulk of the backlog currently, right? So this is, again, showing, basically on the order of 80% are our residential streets. I do want to clarify that even though our arterial and collector streets look like they're doing really well, this is where that annual need comes in, because we continually have these streets dropping into the rehabilitation category and potentially reconstruct if we don't do something to invest in it. But if we turn back to local streets for a few seconds, one of the things that we're really exploring with the team is there could be continued opportunity to calibrate that portion of the backlog. Local streets can sometimes have a much lesser level of treatment to be effective. For instance, slurry seals, which doesn't add a lot of cost, but can effectively address a street that's raveled, where just a lot of the surface material is gone. So we want to continue to focus on really calibrating that local street need to see how that informs our overall backlog need and investment in streets. So currently local streets are about 1.7 million of that annual need. So there is some potential to reduce that. That's kind of the positive side. On the negative side, as you all know, the pace of inflation has been really high the last couple of years, and it's really hard to predict where that's going to go over the course of what would be a next bond measure. So next, let's look at that annual street preservation need. Again, this is that kind of view over time as we reduce the backlog of what we think we need to invest every year to have no streets falling into reconstruct and to address all of our reconstructs in 10 years. And again, I think, that would really be an awesome thing for us to get to. We haven't gotten to that level of funding yet, but we've still been making a really big impact with our investment. So you can see at the beginning of the first bond measure, we expected that we needed about 27 million a year. we were really investing on the order of between 6 and 9 million a year and continuing to make really good headway on the bond measure. We're starting to hit a steady state here, though, now where we see, hey, this number seems to be really tight, that we need about 15 million to really keep that, that system in its best shape. If you look, and again, I apologize for the animation I didn't know I had, but if you look at the gap, we've got about 3 million a year again from local gas tax. That leaves about a $12.6 million gap we're trying to fill. So let's move on to transportation system needs. Historically, the street bond has contained funding for walking, biking projects since the beginning, and it's increased over time. In the first bond, it was 1.7 million total. In the second, in 2012, it was 2.6 million. In the last bond in 2017, it was 5 million. In 2017, the Transportation System Plan identified 71.7 million in active transportation projects that the community was working towards, and we've made significant progress on constructing and securing funding for those, about 20 million overall. If you subtract that from the total need, we get down, 30 million overall. And if you subtract that, you get down to about 41 million in need, but that was in 2014 dollars. So if you adjust that up with inflation, we're really talking more about 54 million in today's needs. And we know that it's likely the process to amend the Transportation System Plan, which we expect to start in early 2023, will increase the need for active transportation funding and other transportation system investments as we identify additional projects to help meet our council-established climate recovery goals. In 2015, Council adopted the Vision Zero goal of 0 fatalities and serious injuries on our transportation system. And in 2019, we adopted the Vision Zero Action Plan administratively, which really set a goal of trying to achieve those 0 fatalities and serious injuries by 2035. This graph is basically our most recent information on the number of serious injuries that we're seeing in the community from transportation-related crashes, including some information in 2021 that's preliminary. And the reason for that, it took a couple of years for ODOT to come out with the official statistics, but we are able to get some information from EPD to help inform our work. You can see that with the start of the pandemic, we did have a reduction in serious injury crashes. It started to bump up a little bit more, but definitely is declining in the right direction. That's not necessarily true with fatalities. So we did see a bit of a dip in 2020 with fatalities, but that came back up to 8 in 2021. And historically, we've seen about 6 people a year that have been killed on our system. So it really highlights the continued need to invest in safety projects. And we currently have 15 streets and 23 intersections identified in the Vision Zero Action Plan that are high crash streets that really need priority investment, as well as investments across the city as a whole. So Eugene's Community Climate Action Plan was updated in 2020. It relies heavily on implementation of the Transportation System Plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation accounts for approximately 53% of our emissions, and the current Transportation System Plan accounts for 62% of the reductions in transportation-related emissions identified in the plan. So again, the plan really heavily identifies or relies, on our Transportation System Plan getting built out. And a lot of those are related to moving people between single car trips and carpooling, walking, biking, taking transit. Additionally, that plan identifies a goal of a 30% urban canopy by 2030. Right now, we're about 23%. So there's a lot of opportunity to really build our urban canopy and in the city. And one of those is our street tree system. We know our street tree system is really an integral part of our street infrastructure and provides a multitude of ecosystem services, reducing street level temperatures, reducing stormwater runoff, sequestering GHG emissions, and enhancing neighborhood character. Our urban forestry team has identified approximately 15,000 potential planting sites to help move this work forward. And you can see that would be in the cost if we fully built that out of about $7 million. Next, let's talk about outreach. So in order to gather feedback to help inform council about a new bond measure to fix streets, our engineering team performed outreach across a number of community stakeholder groups and neighborhood associations. We also performed statistically valid polling, which we'll share in a few minutes. To spur conversation, we presented a range of bond amounts and different scenarios for project types for folks to react to. And went too far. As you can imagine, we received a range of opinions and perspectives that wove into a few common themes. So strong support to keep the tax rate the same as the current bond measure. So don't ask people to pay more than they already are. Continued support to invest in pavement preservation, just foundational stewardship of our street system, and support for increasing the amount of bond funding allocated to walking, biking, safety projects, and potentially expanding that to other areas, as we'll discuss in a few minutes. So one last thing to provide some background information before I hand it over to John Horvick from DHM. Just for your reference, this is the last 3 bond measures, and it's got a few things going on. The blue columns are telling you how many people voted for each of them. In orange, it's how many people voted against it. And then the lines across are the percentage of people voting for it. So 57% in 2008, 64.4% in 2012, and 62% in 2017. And 2017 was a little bit different because the first 2 elections were presidential election years. 2017 was not. So you can definitely see that there was lower turnout, but really a similar passing rate. Okay, and then the last thing that I wanted to share is we had a request from Councillor Clark to include a question about inclusion of what we call unimproved streets, the streets that aren't built up to full city standard. In the bond measure, we were able to include that. So John will be able to share some information on that. So I'm going to stop sharing and let John talk to you a little bit about the polling results.
Thank you. I do see there's a hand up, and I'm not sure what the protocol is, but I'll pause in case that question does need to be asked.
Okay. We'll do it later. Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Let me get this up here. And affirmation, someone give me a thumbs up that it's there. All right. My name is John Horvick. I'm the Senior Vice President at DHM Research. We're an independent, nonpartisan public opinion and policy firm. That means some different things. One way to say it is I'm a pollster. The way I like to say it is it's our job to ask people what sort of communities they want to live in. And a big part of that is their transportation system, as well as their taxes that they pay to support that. And this survey gets right at those key issues. I'm going to walk through the high-level results from the survey. There is some more details as well in a fuller report, but I want to make sure that you all have sort of the big picture. And as we go through this, I guess I would say if there are questions about clarity about what we did, if I've really said something that's confusing and you're not going to be able to understand unless to get it answered, go ahead, ask. Otherwise, we'll try to say Q&A for the overall content at the end. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start by telling you what we did. I'm going to show you the results. And I'm going to sum up by repeating some of the things, but just in a somewhat different way. So that's the drill here. The research purpose, as you could probably guess, we wanted to gauge support for the transportation bond. At the proposed level, we also tested some different levels as well. We wanted to assess the influence of potential projects on support of the bond measure and prioritize potential transportation projects. So this is both to give you a sense of where voters in the community are at, and some details about if you decided to move things around, change the bond package at all, how might voters respond to that? How did we do this? This is what we call a hybrid survey. I'll explain that in just a second, of 400 City of Eugene voters. It was conducted early part of May, so it's just about a month old. So this is still very fresh data. We set quotas by age, gender, race, education, party affiliation, and ward to ensure a representative sample. This is all modeled for November 2022 election turnout. Okay, so it's not all voters. It's not a primary turnout. It's not a presidential turnout. So they're really trying to focus in on what turnout would be by those demographic criteria in a November election. And when I say set quotas, we know that people of different demographic types tend to participate research more readily than others. People who are older tend to participate more than those who are younger. People with more education tend to participate more than with those with less. Women tend to participate more than men. And so if we do a survey and we don't account for any of those facts, we end up with results that are biased towards people who are older, more educated, female. So what we do is we set quotas. We say, all right, we think that this percentage of the electorate is going to be, say, 1829, or this percent is going to come from this part of the city. And once we fill up those buckets, we say, all right, we're going to put all our efforts into making sure we're hearing from those other parts of the community as well. So you should feel really good that this is a good representative sample of the electorate for November election. The margin of error is 4.9%. Now, with regards to being a hybrid survey research and the ways that we reach people have evolved, and more people are expecting to be contacted in different ways. Some really would prefer that traditional way of having someone call, being able to talk to an interviewer, have that survey administered vocally. And other people just want to be contacted by text message. They don't want to have to deal with an interviewer. And so given that reality that people have different preferences and will participate using different approaches, we make sure that we're reaching people multiple ways. So we reach people both with the traditional live interview telephone call and with a text message, where people get sent a text message with a link, and then they can take that survey right there on their smartphone. They can also send that link to another device, a laptop, a tablet, if they prefer, but most people will do it right on their smartphone. One of the questions I often get asked is, do you call cell phones? Yes, we do. Almost all the contacts nowadays are by cell phones. So that's the approach. Real good sample size, multiple ways to reach people, representative of the community. You should feel really good about all of that. As we go through it, if things don't add up to 100%, that's just due to rounding. All right, so early in the survey, we do some different things. One thing is we just usually start with a question, big picture, how are things going in the community? Are heading in the right direction? Are they off on the wrong track? I don't have the data in here, but I'll just share with you that negative sentiments are pretty prominent in communities across, well, Oregon, but really across the country today. And that's true in Eugene. There's a lot of negativity out there, but it's also true in Portland. It's true in Salem. It's true across the state. It's just part of the broader political environment we're in. But we did start with a question, hey, just are things heading in the right direction or wrong track? That helps get people engaged in the survey. It signifies to them this is about community issues. But the kind of the first big survey results I want to share with you is this open-ended question. And we just ask, hey, what's the most important issue that you want your local officials to do something about? And it's open-ended. People can say anything that they want. We read all the comments. We put them into categories that we think are meaningful. We ask this question for at least two reasons. One is just to give you all feedback. What's on voters' minds right now? What is really pressing for them? But also, we're looking to see, where is this issue relative to some other things in the community? Is it really showing up a lot, or is it not really a top of mind thing? When we ask a question like this, and we do this in lots of surveys, hundreds, probably at this point, thousands of times, anytime an open-ended question has responses above 20%, that is more than 1 out of 5 people in the community are saying, this is my most important issue, that's a real yellow light. Because people can say anything they want, right? And so if more than 1 in 5, more than 20% are saying a single issue is the most important thing, that's a real signal that it's driving voter concerns. And here, homelessness, encampments, 51%. Again, this maybe isn't a surprise. as a result, and it's not unique to Eugene. These are the sorts of results we're seeing really up and down the I-5 corridor, also in work that we've done in Bend. When I do focus groups in other parts of the state, the coastal communities in particular, you're also seeing high numbers of homelessness. But it is by far the key issue. And so as you're talking about this bond measure, you expect some comments back from the community to say, hey, why this and not this other thing that I'm concerned about? Doesn't mean the voters will say no, but I do think you have to be prepared to be able to answer that question. You'll see that roads, infrastructure, traffic, transportation kind of that is towards the bottom. About 1% of the comments. Doesn't mean that it doesn't matter at all, for sure, because we're gonna see some other ways that it does. But it's not the top of mind thing. It's being crowded out by some other issues. Next, we asked about specific city services. We asked about fire and emergency, libraries, parks, police, city streets, and homelessness services. And we just said, hey, are you satisfied with the delivery of these services in Eugene? Are you not satisfied? So here the dark green is very satisfied. The light green is somewhat satisfied. The lighter red is somewhat, or so not too satisfied, and the dark red is not at all satisfied. And pay attention. These are the things that lots of things that majority of voters are saying, hey, we're really pretty happy with them, especially fire and emergency medical services. Libraries really up there too. Parks, a little bit of a decline, and you see somewhat of an increase here in the dissatisfaction. Police, we're at 61% satisfied, but you have a fairly large minority that's not satisfied, and that's a trend we've been seeing in other communities too. And then we get to city streets. So here we're at 50% satisfied, but 49% dissatisfied. So here pretty divided. And I think you can read this a couple different ways, but I think in light of this bond, I think what voters are telling us is that, hey, we see a need. We see a need to make improvements to our city streets. And then being able to connect that need to this bond is going to be the goal going forward. And then to validate, so that open-ended question, we see this deep satisfaction with delivery of homelessness services. We then followed up and said, well, here are some specific things the city could be doing in the community. Do you think that this is a high priority or low priority? So again, the sort of the color scheme, the dark green is the very high priority, the light green somewhat high priority, the gray is medium priority, the light red somewhat low, and then the dark red very low. And what I want to focus in on here is our improving safety for all street users and maintaining and repairing streets. If we pay attention to the overall sort of priority, the highs, they're about even. If we look at the very highs, street safety a little bit more, although I think when we look at the total results as we go through this, I think that there's evidence that maintaining, repairing streets is sort of going to motivate voters even more perhaps than safety. I do want to call out here reducing the risks of climate change. So overall, high priority, either very or somewhat, we're at 49. It is qualitative and quantitatively different than these others that we tested in terms of, 28% saying it's a very low priority, 28 plus 7, we're at 35, saying, it's at the low end. Most voters in Eugene see climate change as a priority. Nearly half of voters in Eugene see it as a high priority, but it is the most polarizing issue of the things that we tested. And I'll just say, of all the work that we do, it is one of the most polarizing issues in Oregon right now. It's polarized in different dimensions, especially around partisanship. But we see that here too, where we have this group of people who rate it as a lower priority. So that sort of context setting is going to help us understand the mood of the electorate. It's going to understand how to talk about a potential bond measure. Now we're just going to get to the actual test. And so we tested the bond measure multiple times in the survey. The first time we did it, it was just with the title, with sort of the limitations that are placed by rule and how many words you can use and the required constitutional language. So here are the numbers on the left, but I want you to pay attention to what's over here on the right first. So just to know what we asked. Shall the city of Eugene fix streets and fund bicycle and pedestrian projects using $61.2 million in general obligation bonds? So that language right there fits the requirements in terms of the number of words you can use in a title. And then this language is required. If the bonds are approved, they will be payable from taxes on property or property ownership that are not subject to the limits of sections 11 and 11B of Article 11 Oregon Constitution. It's a lot of words there. It is difficult for a voter to understand what the heck that's all about. But also we want to be as realistic as possible, asking the language as it will appear on the ballot. So when we ask that and we say, all right, do you plan to vote yes for this or no? With just that little bit of information, 46% yes, 44% no. Always pay attention to the certains, right? So we're at 25% yes, certain, 29% no. So these are, pretty mixed, ambivalent sort of voters with only this bit of information. Okay. Now, then next, we gave people a little bit more information. Think of this as the summary that comes underneath that ballot title on the ballot, but also think of it as information you can communicate to voters. It's not on the slide, but I do want to read what we did ask. So what we asked with this informed test, with the summary as it's labeled here, is this language. The $61.2 million bond measure would replace an existing bond that is scheduled to expire in 2024. If the measure is passed, property tax rates would stay at their current rate of 63 cents per $1,000 of assessed value, which is on average $169 per year for the typical home. If the measure is not passed, property taxes would decrease by $145 per year on average for the typical home, but the backlog of needed street repairs would significantly increase, and safety, bicycle, and pedestrian projects would be significantly reduced. So we told voters, hey, taxes aren't going up, tax rates, I should say, tax rates aren't going up if this is passed. And if not, then there's consequences on the other side too. So immediately once we give people to that information, support goes up to 60%. Opposition drops down to 33%. Now, when Matt showed you the trend line of the past bond measures, kind of that high 50, low 60% passage in the past, that's right where we're at. So really in line with where voters have been in the past. And we're about a 2-to-1. Now, pollsters like me, they'll tell you, before you put something on the ballot, you want to see 60% support, and here we got it. It's not well above that, but it's in line with that historical trend. We get 60%, we got that 35% certain yes, 10 percentage points more than that certain no. These are pretty good numbers, not out of world numbers, but pretty solid numbers that I think you should feel good about at this stage. There's a lot of demographic information that I'm not going to share with you today. But there's some places where I'm going to call it some geographic differences. So here are the 8 wards in Eugene, and you can see the informed test, that's the one I just showed you. And then the initial test is, just that title information. And you can see, support increases in every ward. It increases especially in Ward 8, although Ward 7, 8, 5 and 6, 4, really, all of those are softer. It's being carried by wards 1, 2, and 3. You all know your community better than I do, so you may have good explanations for why support is greater in 1, 2, and 3. But be aware that that's where support's being driven, and there's more ambivalence in other parts. I'd say particularly wards 8 and Ward 4. If you look at that initial test at 23%. And it's Ward 6, I think, I'm not sure if I misspoke, but 30% initial test in Ward 6 and just that 23% in Ward 8. All right. So then we're going to give people both some more information, but also to give you guidance about potentially how you might shape the actual bond package. One of the questions going into this is just how much dollars should be dedicated just to street repair and maintenance? And how many dollars should be dedicated towards other projects like safety, bicycle, and pedestrian? And so what we walked people through were some different options, including putting all $12 million per year, the annual amount, into street repair and maintenance, putting $11 million in street repair and maintenance and $1 million in safety, bike, and ped, 10 and 2, 9 and 3. Okay, so we walk them up. Now, half the people heard 12 million first, and half the participants heard 9 million first. So we rotated that sort of ordering, so it wasn't influenced by just what you heard first. You can see that there's this march upwards in support, or people who say that they plan to vote if these different mixes. So that the greatest support was this mix of 9 to 3, 9 street repair and maintenance and 3 in bicycle safety pedestrian projects. Now, I would say that the typical voter doesn't have a clear idea of exactly what that's going to return in terms of investments or the types of projects or the trade-offs. But I do think it's a clear signal to us that, boy, voters want to see that there are some of these safety, bike, and ped projects included in the bond. If there's nothing there, if they learn that there was nothing there, that's going to make more voters apprehensive. Okay. Now, what we don't know is how much further you could take this, right? We didn't test 8 and 4 or 7 and 5, on and on and on. And where might that inflection point be? But I do think this is a signal to everybody. Hey, voters want to see some significant healthy investments in things beyond just street repair and maintenance. And then it's it's up to you all, like what that right exact mix is. The voters, I think, are expecting that. Now, I want to call out these colors here represent the kind of the ratios that I just showed on the previous slide. So 0 on safety, bike, and ped is this lightest blue. A little bit darker is 1 million on safety, bike, and ped, and then 2 and 3. You'll notice in every ward, save 4 and 6, that support increased as you put more into bike, ped, and safety. But wards 6 and 4, for whatever reasons, now, I don't have a good hypothesis about why. Again, you know your community better than I do, but for whatever reasons, support declined in wards 4 and 6. And that might say something about the types of voters that live there, the types of streets that they have, the connections to other parts of the community, whatever it might be. But that's something to maybe think about and reflect on and make some decisions about. So now we wanted to give you some information about how voters might think about complete streets. And we gave people these sort of concepts about, well, at the top here, adding new sidewalks and repairing existing sidewalks as an element. If that were part of the bond, would that make you more likely to support it or less likely to support it? And you can see 64% of voters said, hey, it makes me more likely to support it. Just 12% less likely. Adding pedestrian crossing signals on busy streets, 62% more likely. Upgrading street lighting, 61% more likely. Planting trees on boulevards along the streets, 57% more likely. Where it's a little bit softer is adding traffic calming to neighborhood streets to reduce speeds. Now 43% said that may make them more likely to support the bond measure. 25% said to make them less likely. And again, we don't have data in these in this particular survey to say exactly why that sort of resistance is greater with this one, but that's what the data are telling us. But mostly in a positive direction. Street calming moves things in a slightly different way. Now, if we ask, do you support or oppose the bond allowing additional funds to be used in complete streets? It's a little mix. 48% more said, yeah, I support that. 39% said that they oppose. And I think that the reason we don't see a higher percentage here of support, I'm going to go back to this slide, is because this was part of it, right? So we asked people about all of these, including adding traffic calming, which only had 43% more likely. And then we followed up with, do you want these types of projects? Well, one of these types of projects was street calming. And that, my guess is it's that element that's pulling this down a little bit. And then, as Matt was saying earlier, we did include this as well about repaving projects that target streets that don't have curbs and gutters. And the options here was, would that make you more likely to support the measure? Would it make no difference? Or would it make you less likely to support the measure? And I think the takeaway here, if we take the more likely at 26 plus no difference at 47, I can't do the math in my head that quickly, but we're at roughly 70, give or take. Either feeling positive or saying, hey, I'm okay one way or the other about this. We're getting very little opposition. Just 19% said they'd be more likely to oppose the measure. I think this isn't something on its own that voters are particularly motivated by. It's a policy question for you. If you think it's a good idea, if you think you can reallocate the money in a way that sort of fits with what other voters are telling us, I don't think there's any risk to that. It's not going to drive a lot of support either, but it's also not minimizing support. And then we asked just, hey, what about increasing this? What about making it a little bit bigger? So we asked, this is the original, the 61.2, and then we said, well, what about 65.7? What about 70.5? And you said it could do some other good stuff. And you see support drops pretty, a pretty good amount, from 60% to 46 to 41. Now, we did put these in front of voters as a choice, right? We asked about 61.2, and then we asked a bunch of questions about the bond measure that sort of had that in mind. And then we said, hey, do you want to pay more? So do interpret the results in that light, but also know that 65.7 and 70.5 would be a tax increase rather than holding rates the same. And I think what voters are telling us here is, good. I'm good with continuing to make this investment, but I'm anxious about an increase, and I think that's showing up here. And then you can just see some of these differences by ward. Again, wards 1, 2, and 3. That's where the strongest support is. Wards 5, 7, and 8 a little bit softer, and then wards 4 and 6 are particularly soft. And you can sort of see across the levels themselves. Getting towards the end here, but just a little bit more on prioritization. We did give people these different types of projects and said, if you had to choose one, what would be your highest priority? And here we do see repairing and maintaining existing streets as the number one. And you can see improving safety at 13%, providing more walking and biking options, 14%. Now, these might be safety, these could both be safety features. So, I mean, you could think of them that way as well. Reducing carbon emissions at 11. So it is lower than others. We'll see here that there are some differences across the community with regards to that. But repairing and maintaining streets, the number one. Reducing traffic congestion is 19. And I understand that this bond measure isn't targeted towards that. It's not like we're not adding capacity with this bond measure. But we include this because we know that a lot of voters are going to expect that with any funding package to see congestion reductions. That's just doing lots of research that follows for a typical voter one to the next. And so I call it out not to think about how to shape the bond, but hey, signal to you, some voters are going to say that's a priority, and then be thinking about how to talk to them about this bond measure in light of the fact that some voters say that that's the number one priority. If we look at some of these just by ward, you'll see that repairing and maintaining existing streets, 6 out of 8 wards, this dark X means it's the number one priority in that ward. So this is pretty consistent across the entire community. I'd say Ward 3 stands out as being different. They prioritize safety and congestion, and then Ward 7 prioritize carbon emissions and more walking and biking options. So they're a little bit different the others, but so broadly, this repairing and maintaining streets was in 6 out of the 8 wards, so pretty consistent. And then, so that's where I show you all the charts. And this is just where I repeat myself, just kind of in a different format, but just to kind of the highlights as I see them, is that we start with just under half of the voters supporting the bond. And that might give us a little pause, but we do see that immediate jump up to 60% when voters are informed about the details, particularly that's not going to increase property tax rates. All right, so and it's that 60% threshold that I want to see, and it's in line with where you've been in the past. Among those who oppose the bond, voters who are certain of their objection only show their slightest shift. So this isn't in the deck that I showed you, it's in the full deck, but if you look at opponents really held steady, right? What we moved were sort of those don't know people who started off uncertain. it's going to be hard to persuade no voters to be yes, but there are a number of voters who are coming into this without their minds made up, and that ought to be the focus. And then we do see these important geographic differences as well as some other demographic differences. Democrats are the most supportive, college graduates. Frequent voters is great to see that in terms of anything that's on the ballot. You want to see those frequent voters be more supportive. And then residents in wards 1 through 3. And that's, the residents Ward through 3 pretty dramatically are the ones who are supportive. And then sort of the opposite for sort of the softer supporters or opponents. Completed street projects, they mostly increase support. With the, so half the voters support providing funds for safety, bicycle, and pedestrian projects, even if they know it's going to reduce the amount dedicated to paving. That was the trade-off, like the 12-0, the 11-1, the 10-2. They wanted to see investments in bike ped and safety. And then projects that target streets without curbs and gutters are not especially important to voters. It doesn't mean don't do it. It means it's not going to sort of motivate voters to say yes or no. I think you can include it. There's policy trade-offs, and it's a policy decision more than an electoral one. Larger bond amounts don't do well, right? We see that there's still support in wards 1 through 3, where we're seeing consistent support throughout this, but really low level of support across other parts of the community. It would be difficult to increase the size of this, I think, for sure. And then repairing and maintaining existing streets is the top issue for voters in general. There's some ways you might think about it where you can see trade-offs, or not trade-offs, but you could emphasize safety as being important to voters. But I think big picture, that maintenance issue is really what most voters are looking for. And we see it across the community in the 6 out of those 8 wards. And just a reminder that there are large partisan differences among side priorities, particularly reducing carbon emissions. But all voters, regardless of party, other demographics, support repairing, maintaining existing streets as their top priority. And I think that's it. That's it. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I can pull this back up again if it's necessary. And I'm happy to answer questions, be part of a conversation as helpful, and then just turn it back to you all.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I think there's so much for council to talk about and kind of chew on and all that. And some pieces were a little surprising to me, but most seems to make complete sense from what we know about our community, where we've been. So
Mayor, before you jump in, I think Matt has some final comments.
Oh, okay.
He has a tiny bit more, but he'll be quick.
I want to run through really quickly.
Sorry, Matt, didn't mean to.
That's okay. All right, I'm going to share again really quickly and try and roll through this. So bear with me. Oh boy. I know this is not the view I want. So a second. Is that showing up as a presentation view now? Okay. So really quickly, based on all of the totality of information and the polling, there's some staff suggestions for consideration by council. One would be to keep the tax rate the same. That seemed clear. Continue to have a mix of, to have named streets for pavement preservation projects and a separate bucket of funding for walking, biking, safety, and street tree projects potentially being added. And we would, of course, continue to leverage funds that we have locally to bring in more investment from federal and state funds. We do recommend keeping an external auditor and annual report, and the Department Advisory Committee, which is the Street Repair Review Panel, which are the accountability measures. For the portion of the bond, the portion of the bucket that would be walking, biking, and safety and street tree needs, if council elects to go that way, we've provided a list of guidance documents and committees that could be used to help prioritize those projects. And when thinking about, two specific staff recommendations we have for alternatives, there really is taking the totality of information and trying to find that balance between keeping significant investment in pavement preservation and addressing some of our other needs. So 2 alternatives that you saw in your AIS, just to mention. Alternative 1 would be doubling the amount of money for walking and biking, adding safety and street tree projects to be eligible, keeps about $51 million of the total bond amount towards capital pavement preservation, which is about 4.7 more than the last bond did. It's 50 named streets, and it brings that gap down to about 2.4 million between the annual need and what this would provide in funding. Alternative 2 would triple the amount of money for walking, biking, again, bring safety and street tree projects in to be eligible. It's about 45.9 million in capital preservation. That's almost exactly the amount of the same bond. And obviously with inflation, it means we're losing a little bit of buying power with this. So we feel like this is on the aggressive side of the balance. It includes 43 named streets, and you'd end up with an annual gap of 3.4 million. And lastly, I want to just share that Councilor Zelenka, identified for us that there was a mistake in the street list of where there were some Ward 3 streets or some Ward 2 streets listed as Ward 3 streets. We would need to correct that in any street list to rebalance and make sure the investments were close across wards for your consideration if you do elect to go forward on July 13th. Just a reminder again of where we are. We're looking for basically potential direction to bring a resolution back to put a bond measure on the ballot. And July 13th would be the time we have reserved for council consideration. And with that, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Matt. That was helpful to have that "where are we going" summary. All right, I have a lineup of counselors. So first Alan, then Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a clarifying question. When we say it won't increase property taxes, it's really, we should be saying it's increased property tax rate. Because if someone's assessed value goes up and they have the same rate, they pay more property taxes, right? Even if it's the same rate.
I'm not sure if the question is directed to me. I'll just say I tried to be. I caught myself once or twice, but we made it. Yes, we made it clear in the research that it's rates, and that yes, that's accurate to my understanding. But others could weigh in.
Do people make any distinction between actual payment and the rate? Actually, how much?
I'm not sure if that question is directed to me or not. I mean, I think being able to tell. I think from an electoral matter, being able to tell people that the rates aren't going up is a powerful. We see immediately the support increases by about 13, 14, whatever it was, 12, 13%, but they knew that was the case. And then, there's lots of other things that are going to happen with people's property taxes, outside of this measure. And it's hard to pull that out for voters.
Right. I got that. And as the maker of the motion that doubled our bike ped spending investment dollars last go around for the bond, I'm more than enthusiastic to support option 2, which does that and a little bit more, increases spending on bikes and ped and safety and street tree projects. So totally there. One of the issues I had with that, though, is I think the successful formula for the bonds had 3 components to it. When we originally put this together, when we first did it, and I was one of the proponents and builders, authors of this formula, which is that people knew there were a specific list of projects. People knew exactly what they were buying, and we weren't going to change the list. The second was that we had rough equity. Everybody around the city gets some benefit. And the third was we had some accountability, that we had the promises made, promises kept. So we had the auditor and this civilian review committee to make sure that we did what we said we were going to do. And all 3 of those things combined make it first successful. And in this case, there's no list for the bike ped safety street trees projects. So people don't know what they're buying. Before, that wasn't such a big deal because it was only a small percentage. It was $500,000, and it got bumped to $1 million. But now it's $3 million if we go with option 2, and that's 20%. And that's fundamentally different than before. So the problem is time. We don't have enough time to get us a list and get public input on the list and vet it. So I'm wondering if we can add to the resolution statement that refers to the outcome of a future process where we would come up with that list before the voters vote, and whether or not we can add that in and be part of this process. It's a city manager, city attorney question, I think.
So I can maybe take a first shot at that, Councillor Zelenka. I think what we could define in the resolution is the guidelines for how we would make a decision. And that's similar to what we did in all of our bond measures. So, you know, for the bike ped component, which was 5 million in the last one, we said, you know, we're going to work with the Active Transportation Committee. I think you saw in what I'd listed, we had added some more plans. If it was desired by council, we could include that a public outreach process would be done to inform the list. These plans would be used in these, you know, committees, whatever you wanted them to be: Active Transportation, Sustainability, Vision Zero Advisory Committee, which are all fairly relevant, could be consulted to form a list.
That didn't quite answer my question. Can we actually add in reference to a process in the future that would be voted on, that the voters would see before we voted?
That I'll jump in. No, you can't have a list added after you vote on the resolution. If that's what I think I hear you saying, that you would be referring to a future produce list that one would become part of what is being referred to the voters. What that resolution is what is specifically referred to the voters. And once you adopt that resolution, it becomes an election measure, and there's only very specific things that can happen and that staff can do around the election measure. One is my preparation of the ballot title, which has to happen within 10 days of your adoption of that resolution, and our ballot titles reference what people are voting on. So having a reference within the resolution of a process that will be followed, so they'll understand that if you vote on this, you'll be voting, this process will be followed. But a reference to a yet to be created list to then get added later isn't something that I see us being able to do.
Right, I anticipated the answer. So can the council, I think what Matt said is fine, but it's insufficient. So if the council would commit to a process and treat it like the street tree list, meaning it's a set project list and we're not going to change it, and then we do that before November 8th, and we tell people what the list is, it'd be part of the package. It wouldn't be part of the particular bond measure that's on the ballot, but it would be our commitment to make sure that that happens. And that, I think, is necessary to keep that the first part of the three-legged stool of the successful bond measure formula, which is the specific project list, because this is much bigger and more important. I'll need round 2, Mayor. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, Randy and then Matt.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Matt and John, for a very informative presentation. I think I'm going to have to go back and watch this tape again just to try and absorb all this, but it's really important information. I got to say, I'm a little surprised that the traffic calming and the street lighting factored in as low as it did, because I consider those pretty important for safety. But, you know, I certainly trust the work that was done. One piece for you, Matt, in following up, Councillor Zelenka found some streets that were not correctly listed. On Bethel Drive on both lists, it's listed as being in wards 6 and 8, and I believe that's wards 6 and 7. So can look at that piece. And then as far as specific streets, you caught most of the ones that I think are important, at least in my ward, but I do have a question, and I mean, I'll be happy to get the answer later. Blackburn is in terrible shape, and I was really surprised not to see it on here. I'm certainly not trying to insert something ahead of another ward, but I would really like to have some separate data or information on how that did not make the list, because I know I'm going to get questions from residents on that street. And then the last question I have is, how do we tie in if a street does not need repair, but it's certainly inadequate for pedestrian and bicycle? And I'm speaking specifically about Warren Street in my ward, which has a real narrow section, no sidewalks, brush encroaching into the street, and there's no school bus that runs up there. So we have school kids walking and biking to school where they have nowhere to go, and there's some turns in the road and visibility challenges, and it's a steep grade too with vehicles coming downhill. And I would really like to find out, is there a way to tie that to safe routes to school? What are some avenues where we can maybe dip into other areas even beyond the road bond, just to get with safety being an emphasis? So, and again, I don't need a response today unless you have that for that piece. There might be other counselors with similar concerns, but the Blackburn piece I would like to hear back on as well. Thank you.
Councilor Groves, I'll just very briefly try to address your last question. So we have a regional, we have a group of Safe Routes school coordinators that coordinate regionally and actually have a list, a prioritized list. I think it's in the hundreds of Safe Routes to School projects. So we do have a regional coordination, a system by which we prioritize them. And I can look and see if that's on that. We also created a system for our TSP projects that are active transportation focus and how to prioritize those. So we've built some internal systems that help us, identify streets and try to match them to opportunities, because that's another important part of getting a project delivered is how we can match maybe a federal grant or state grant opportunity.
Thank you. That would be appreciated. Maybe even some brush mitigation. That this has been raised by the people on the CAN Neighborhood Association board, and I drove it this morning just to take another look at it, and I do consider it problematic. So, from a safety standpoint, if there's things we can look at to mitigate that, that would certainly be appreciated by people in my ward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and then Mike.
Great, thanks, Mayor. Thank you, Councilor Groves, for pointing out the Blackburn Street in your ward in disrepair. I used to live there. I have family that lives there, and you are so right on that it is pothole after pothole, and so I appreciate you calling attention to that. You and Councilor Zelenka both mentioned the proposed potential street bond paving projects. And that there was some errors in regards to the amount of projects in various wards. And one of the projects would be like right out here. I'm pointing to one of the streets on this list, which would be welcome considering our neighborhood streets. But the projects are listed multiple times, from Agate Street to 31st, and then there's another project from starts on 31st. It goes from Agate to Onyx. Why are those not just? Why is that not just one project? Why are the projects split up? Why is it not a continuous project?
So, Councilor Keating, I'll need to bring up that list to probably answering that question with authority. But typically, the way our pavement preservation system works is there's segments. Each street is broken into segments, and typically we'll have groups of segments that were paved at the same time in the past. So when we look at them again, we look at those segments and bring them on. It could easily just be put into one project on the list. I think probably what it was staff adding it by segment, which is the way that data is fed to them.
Okay, that's helpful. I suspect that the projects will look a little more even when those are combined. What's the process by which a counselor like Councilor Groves would want to bring a particular project to the committee's or bring a project to fruition? There are constituents here who've complained about West Amazon in particular. How would one get West Amazon on this list, or learn where West Amazon may be on this list?
I'm not sure which section of West Amazon you're talking about. It might be the more southern portion that's unimproved. Between basically, we would have the ability to refine that list. The list would not be part of what you were making a decision about today.
Right.
So we'd have an opportunity to check in and receive any feedback folks have about the lists for their ward in between now and July 13th. We do want to make sure we're leading as much as we can with kind of the, science-based asset management program we have of where to put investments, but happy to talk about, specific concerns and priority streets councilors may have.
Great, thanks. Shifting to the polling data, thank you, John, for the information. Do you and Matt suspect that the terms complete streets and traffic calming may be somewhat nebulous and open to interpretation by those who participated in the poll, and that might be a reason why there was a dip in support level for those aforementioned issues?
I'll let John talk to complete streets because we know that one isn't that well known. I think traffic calming is fairly consistently known in my opinion, but go ahead, John.
Yeah, so the way it was done is we asked people about those individual elements. I'm looking at as I look down the questionnaire here, but we asked about upgrading street lighting, adding pedestrian crossing, adding traffic calming, all those different things. And then the follow-up question here is the language. The types of projects in the previous question or previous questions are part of what transportation planners call complete streets. So when we use complete streets, we defined it as those specific types of projects.
Okay, helpful. Were scooters mentioned at all in the survey? Because they were not part of our poll report when it comes to safety.
No, scooters were not.
Okay. In 2008, 2017, or 2008, 2012, and 2017, you provided us a snapshot of turnout and support. But what we didn't see and what I would like to see would be polling data leading up to the decision that council made in 08, in 12, and 17. How did the polling data, how did we go from having an informed decision prior to making the decision to go out for a bond and then renewal in 8, 12, and 17, respectively? I know it was obvious, not obviously, but I suspect it was a different polling firm. But it would be most interesting to see where support started and where it ended, and especially as we are going potentially to go out for this in advance of a midterm election, which could be most difficult. I'm going to need a second round, Mayor, because I have some reservations about the timing. I'd like to articulate that a little more clearly.
Okay, got it. Mike, and then Jennifer, and then Claire.
Hey, Mayor, I do want to echo Randy's concerns about the upper part of Warren. I would say that a portion of that upper part is the homes along that are still on county property. I know that only because I used to live in one of them for about 10 years, right in that crazy, it's an incredibly dangerous street that's an incredibly steep grade while it's also curvy back and forth and overgrown. So it's terribly, terribly dangerous up there for pedestrians. As we increase, well, let me ask first, Matt, the portion of regular funding that is not bond funding for all of the work that we've discussed is all fuel taxes, either local or state. I'm right about that, aren't I?
It's really local fuel tax. The state fuel tax predominantly goes towards our maintenance and operations. We have been successful at some points in the past getting federal funds that help for pavement preservation as well. But yes, it's mostly local fuel tax.
But my distinction is they're all fuel taxes. They're not general funds. They're all produced at either the state or the local level by folks buying gas, right?
That's correct. Yep.
So I wonder out loud, as we do a higher and higher and higher percentage each time we do this of bike and ped, I haven't heard any discussion on the council or from staff on how we get those folks to pay their way when it comes to the money we're spending here. Is there any discussion at staff about revenue sources from bicyclists?
There's not. There was a state tax put on the sales of bicycles a couple sessions ago, but we haven't talked about that as staff.
Well, I just want to say that, nobody, obviously from the polling, nobody likes an increase in the amount of taxes they're paying. But I actually think, and have mentioned before, that I think a licensing system locally for bicycles would also help the police with stolen bicycles, and might be a source by which we could do more, at least certainly maintenance, with regard to our extensive bicycle network. So, thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer and then Claire.
Thank you. So thank you very much for this report. John, I am the counselor for Ward 4 that had the surprising results. I was also a little surprised. Although I wonder, I'm trying to think through why we might have had those results. And I'm wondering if perhaps many of the streets that I get complaints about are unimproved streets that wouldn't qualify for this program. So, you didn't break that question down by geographic area. It was a small group of people that supported, who said that would make a difference to them. And I'm wondering, I don't know if you know this, if that group that it did make a difference, if we know where those folks are. I'm just curious.
It's knowable. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I can certainly follow up with you. All the questions I can break down by ward, and so that's something that could be done. I might need Matt's help to know say this. I want to make sure I'm getting the specific question right. So when I look it up, I'm following up with the right information.
So it was the one where you asked them if it would make a difference to them if we included streets that didn't have gutters and sidewalks.
Oh yeah, I can get that information. I can follow up with Matt, and then I assume it'll get over to the appropriate folks.
Yeah, I would just be curious because I do not have a lack of people who are concerned about our streets in our area, and certainly. The neighborhood associations are very vocal about, especially sidewalks. But I'm wondering if their concern might be that they won't qualify because of many of the streets they're concerned about are these unimproved streets. So I'm just putting that out there as a possible reason for the very interesting results.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I would appreciate getting that back. I also just wanted to say that I would be in support of the option 2 as well. I do share Alan's concerns about it being very nebulous about where this money is going to go, and that I wonder if that will bother some folks, especially folks in my area, who I think having the lists where they can see what they're going to get is very important to them. I think folks in North Eugene don't always trust that things will be equitably distributed. And so seeing that list, I think, is very important. But I understand the legal ramifications of doing that is just not going to work. So I'm not sure how we can deal with that. I don't like the idea of just trust us, we're going to do a good job, and then it gets reported at the end where the money went. Although I think staff in the past have done a good job of distributing funds around the town. So I guess that is all I have. Thank you.
Matt, I see your hand, Matt Rodriguez. Did you want to comment?
Yeah, I'll just very briefly. So I just wanted, because this isn't something I highlighted, we actually did include, I think it's 4 streets that are unimproved on this list, one of which is Bethel Drive, which is by far the largest investment. And we know in an area in Draensong that could use extra investment. So there are 4 unimproved streets. The other thing is for walking, biking projects, in the past, and projects, if they're included in this bond, and safety and street trees as well, those don't have to be on improved streets. So you can do a sidewalk on a street that is unimproved. We've used funds in that way, depending on the overall prioritization as well. So just a clarification.
That is really helpful, and maybe something we can make sure people know about. So I was under a misunderstanding about that as well.
Okay, Claire, and then we'll go into second rounds.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. And thank you, John, for your presentations. Very, very informative. So a couple of questions about the list. So you just confused me with your mention of Bethel Drive and Train Song, Matt, because Train Song's in Ward 7 and the Bethel Drive listing doesn't include Ward 7. So I was feeling like it was part of Bethel Drive that's not in Ward 7.
I think there might be a fundamental correction we need to make on how words were applied to this list. So I apologize to everyone for that. We will need to double check that.
Paved would be fantastic in that part of my ward. So I appreciate that. I had a question about, because I just got an email from a constituent about Irvington Road. And the way the project is listed in here, it's hard for me to know the length, because it says, basically I'm interpreting driveway 110 as the one side of it and Northwest Expressway as the other. So if offline, you could send me approximately what the parameters of that length of Irvington Road will be, that would be appreciated.
Will do.
So I definitely, I support option 2 with the higher amount. I definitely support adding street trees into this. I'm asking about the idea that Councilor Zelinka has put forward, which I think he is saying, could we say in the resolution, we will engage in a process that creates a list for the bike pedestrian projects, maybe even the street trees, and then be able to provide that list to voters as part of our, ballot measure statement, right? Is it practical for us to think that we could come up with that list before the ballot measure statement would need to be submitted?
No, and I'll say that because there's a couple things. One, I just want to highlight again that a lot of our walking and biking projects are opportunistic, and it's kind of hard to forecast out, I think, the complete investment into those projects in advance. The other thing is that typically those need more community involvement than a street repaving project does. So it'd be a bit presumptive to include that list, because I believe that would need to be done. I mean, the resolution, you're scheduled for action if you choose to go forward on July 13th. And there's just no way we'd be able to do that.
No, not to have it included in the measure itself. But so councilors are going to create a little committee that is going to write a ballot measure statement. And so the ballot measure statement could include a list of projects. That's my question.
So part of what we have to work within, like the committee that is created, that is, as you as a political elected officials are fully able under the elections law to advocate for the adoption of this. And that committee is part of that. You form that, you write it yourself. We are prohibited under elections law as staff from supporting those efforts. So where it's starting to get a little gray and something we've never done before is if we're creating a project list that is going to be used, if the staff is working to create a project list that will be a part of the elected officials committee to support this, that gets a little gray just overall with elections law. So I'm not comfortable saying right now that we could wait, have the staff do that work to create that project list for you and have you all use it.
So my question is there time between adopting this resolution, engaging our bike ped committees and all the lists that you did to create a project list before voters vote on this? That's my question.
What's happening right now is, could we come up with a list before voters vote? Yes, but what Catherine is saying is once that is out there, we're not able to do that work.
I get that.
Okay.
I get that part. So I wasn't asking you to do the work. I'm asking Matt if it doesn't seem to me it is practical, and I'm using up a lot of my time that I had more to say. So I'm going to have to ask for another round.
Okay. Well, we're ready for a second round. So I have Alan, Matt, and then Claire coming back.
Yeah, thanks for that, Claire. Just to be specific, that my thought process, just to be clear, when we first brought up the idea of a specific list of names of streets to be included in the bond measure, we got the same pushback from staff, which was, if you put out a specific list, you're not gonna, it's gonna be divisive, and people are gonna, it's gonna give people reasons to vote no, and da da da. And I think that ended up not being correct. And the reason it's so, it's not that it creates opposition because there's a specific list. The reason we put in the specific list of projects was a trust issue. It was about our people's perception that we were promising to do something and we were going to do it. And the people that trust, and the way we got to that was we said, and here's the list, and we won't change it. And I think that holds for bike ped street tree safety projects as well. I think they can garner support. They might garner some opposition, but so does a specific list of things you don't want to be bothered by specific road projects. So I think it's really not so much about all of that, but it's really about the specific list creates trust in what we're doing and making a promise and then keeping it by all those accountability mechanisms that we have. So, that's that. And then secondly, on the list, Matt, I got, you're gonna, the metric's not number of streets, it's dollars invested. So maybe the list could have dollars invested. So that goes into, so the rough equity is supposed to be dollars invested, and that's going to be done before we come back in July 13th, right? On the street projects?
Yes. Yeah.
And it'll be roughly equal. It won't be exact.
As much as we can, yeah, as much as we can.
Right. Okay. The final point on street trees, I was talking to Scott Altenhoff, who used to be our urban forester, now is the state urban forester, because if you do good stuff in Eugene, you get promoted to the state level. He said to me that we could achieve our 30% goal in just the right of way and public lands, and wouldn't have to go to regulating private lands or anything like that. That's my understanding from Scott. Is that your understanding, Matt, city manager?
I'd need to check with our park staff to confirm that. I know there's a lot of opportunity, but I'm not sure what the modeling shows about, getting that extra 7% of canopy.
Because this came up in House Bill 2001, which was about the street tree ordinance, and that's coming back as a work session. So that's a particularly important part of that thing. And this could be a way of getting at that promise, of making sure that we have that list of specific trees. The timer disappeared on my thing. I can't see. So I would like us to get back to the point Claire was making. I still think a process whereby we create a list over the next 4 months is doable and a smart thing to do, because I think it, especially in the wards where it goes up, wards 1, 2, and 3, you saw the biggest jump when you said bike ped, and they care the most about that. The rest of the wards, the jump doesn't come from them.
Alan, thank you. Okay, Matt, and then Claire.
Thank you, Mayor. I mentioned some heartburn around going out for this bond because timing is not on our side. I suspect there won't be much organized opposition. Nevertheless, we're 131 days, 10 hours, and 36 minutes to Election Day. Not that I'm counting. So fewer than 132 days to Election Day. There's no political action committee established. And I would support the option 2, dedicating $3 million the bond funds per year of the 15 million to walking, biking, and safety and street tree projects. I think that's a sound approach, and it sounds like there's a majority of colleagues who are supportive of that. But I have grave reservations about going out for a bond in a midterm election year in this economy, in this divisive political climate. 46% support the bond right out of the gate, and 60% it jumps to when there's more information provided. The 3 wards that are carrying the bond at this juncture, or the proposed bond at this juncture, don't have any competitive seats in them other than gubernatorial and congressional campaigns. Where there's competitive seats for county commission, for example, in the sliver of Eugene and Santa Clara, the support wanes. I would want to look historically at why this bond measure passed so significantly in 8 and in 12 high turnout years, presidential election years, and then in 17 with a smaller pool of the electorate participating, and compare and contrast that with the climate we're in right now. So there's no surprises when there's a motion on the table. As Council Vice President, I'll second it, but I likely will substitute November 22 for November 23. It's a smarter play to give us the time to do the outreach needed and to build the case that's needed, rather than do so with time not on our side. That being said, well, I think I'll wait to go into that point further once there's a motion on the table. I caution folks going out for something in a year that very well could mirror 2010 and 2014. So colleagues, you've heard me. I will support it if there's a majority, but at this point, I have great reservations about going out in 131 days. Thanks.
Okay, Claire, and then Mike.
Thanks. So I'll just say my recollection is that, so I wasn't on council in 2008, but in 2012 and 2017, that our polling came in pretty close, may have been a little lower than where the votes came in. Mike's saying no. So it was either closer, I mean, within 1 or 2 points, right? Like the polling was pretty on the money. And I agree with Councilor Zelenka that having the list was an advantage. And then we had to deal at some point. You guys had more money left over after the fact, and were you not allowed to spend it because it wasn't on the list? And, we figured that out, right? So in thinking about the bike ped, I recognize, Matt Rodriguez, what you're saying about leveraging target of opportunities, right? That there might be a small project that can just be added and it might not be on a list. So in thinking about a list, whether it's attached to the voting or not, I think we need to create a list at some point that is publicized. And it could be created in such a way that there's still some extra left over for those target of opportunities. I would feel better, but I will still vote for this resolution if we did try to do what Alan is suggesting and add some language or have a separate motion that directs city staff to work on engagement of our active transportation committee, our Vision Zero committee, et cetera, to develop a list that then councilors would be responsible for educating the public that this is the list that is meant for this other part of the bond. I don't think it will be a poison pill to this passing if we don't have a list. I will say that, because we have kept faith and people have seen improvements. And that's why it's not up there high on the list the way it would have been in 2008 if we'd done this polling, and people would have said, fix the streets, right? Homelessness was not as big a concern then, and I think there would have been a flip on that polling. I'm not surprised that voters in Ward 7 named reducing emissions as a top priority, as well as safety improvement. That goes along with what I hear from, you know, the active members of my ward. And then I had more to say in response to what Mike shared about making pedestrians pay their same way for their impacts, but I'll hold off on that.
Okay, I just want to point out it is 1:30 and I have 3 counselors with their hands raised and we still have a motion to put on the table. So can I have a motion to extend by 15 minutes, please?
Move to extend by 15.
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Opposed? 1. Okay, passes. Will extend. Thank you. And then we have Mike and then Matt. No, let's see. Mike and then Matt. Yeah. Mike, go for it.
Thank you, Mayor. I wait with rapt attention to hear Claire's presentation on pedestrians. That will be fun. I will look forward to that. I want to ask, I share Claire and Alan's sentiment that we should have some kind of specific information about where and what we're doing when we're asking for this. I agree that's a wiser course. But I want to ask Catherine a more specific question to see if I think I'm right about what I think is the issue here. Because that particular list has not yet been developed by staff in advance of us voting to put it out, and we vote, hey, create this list, could one in opposition or otherwise make the argument that the city's legal obligation to remain neutral be in jeopardy? Because that could be, one could make a case that that's the work of staff in advocating in favor of this measure on the ballot.
That's my concern, because once a ballot measure becomes an election measure, so once you adopt the resolution, right, it's not just that staff is prohibited from doing the advocacy themselves. Staff is actually prohibited from doing stuff to help you all do your advocacy. So that is my concern, that because it's not, and it's why the resolutions are as robust as they are, because all that information gets put in there before it becomes an election measure. So this is never, I'm only knowing, I've never looked specifically at this issue, but that is what you're hearing me express, that because even if the direction's given at the time that you take did the election resolution or the ballot resolution, excuse me, that all of that work afterwards, once it's become an election measure, to be then used by elected officials for purposes of getting the ballot measure passed. That is what you're hearing from me. That is what I am concerned about.
That's what I thought, and I didn't think that was clear.
I apologize.
Not any fault of yours. I just didn't think all of us were hearing that the same way, and I wanted to make sure. But I don't want to put staff in the position of being in jeopardy of advocating by virtue of what we tell them. But again, I feel, as Claire and Alan do, that it's wise to have that information. So maybe as a separate motion at some other time, we could alter our process so that it comes to us whole next time, perhaps. Thank you.
Okay, I have 3 counselors in for a third round, but I just want to interject clarity, because what about this question of a list of whether for this title, it seems to me that Matt Rodriguez had said to us there could be guidance that would say we would have guidance that we will have this public engagement process with our stakeholders to develop that list. And that information that potentially could be included in the resolution. So it would be a commitment by the council to say, we are committing to that guidance before that list is finalized. Right? Okay. All right. So with that said, that would be my suggestion, is that's how you go. All right, we have, I have Alan, then Matt, then Claire.
Yeah, I'll offer to moderate the debate between Claire and Mike on bike ped. Just throwing that out there. So Catherine, concern is not the same as an opinion. And what you're saying is you need to do more research. My interpretation is that council directing us to staff to take the natural course of work to create a list of projects that this would create, that this would be done, is not advocating. It's just normal work that the city staff would be doing. Taking that information and using it in a campaign is advocating. So I think those two things are very separate. I would like you to go back and look at that a little bit more. I think there have been instances where people have created lists in the interim and not in other cities, and maybe even in Eugene, where that's not been a problem. So I don't know that that's the case. So I think the guidance is necessary in the resolution of the motion, but it's insufficient. I think us pointing to making a commitment to doing this process and informing the voters about it is what's really important. So including something in the motion that in this motion or in the resolution that we do eventually that points to that. We don't have to, if I got what you're saying, Catherine, correctly, we don't have to say in the ballot measure that we will follow the list that will be created, but we can say in the ballot measure that there will be a public process and there isn't going to be a list created that we will stick to.
Yes. I mean, that is what could be referred. And I think when I agree with you that work just being done by staff is not advocacy, but there is some specific elections law around just generating neutral information, providing that will be used for advocacy. There's stuff around that too. So that is why it's not, and since it's being made clear that that's how you intend to use it, there's not a lot of gray there. We know that the list is being created for that purpose. But I certainly can take a closer look. This isn't something that's been asked before.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's necessarily advocacy. It's more like if somebody said, well, what projects? And you said, there's the list. I don't know if that's advocacy as much as is informing. So there's a distinction between advocacy and informing. So if somebody said, what's the list of projects? And you said, here's the list, that's not advocating in my mind. So I'll think about this more in the time before we move for the resolution on July 13th. But I don't know if we need to add something to this motion because of time and complexity. Thanks, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Matt and then Claire.
Thanks. And in regards to this conversation, the Lane Community College bond that passed, it was very clear what the bond dollars were going to go to. And the college as an entity didn't advocate, but informed the public very clearly. And it was up to elected officials and campaign operatives and volunteers to advocate. So I don't see any real reason why that should be articulated any differently in the motion. And I wouldn't want to get in the way of staff doing the work to provide that information. I do have a couple quick questions. John, you mentioned that pollsters are looking for support level north of 60%. It's been my experience that when you engage in a poll like this and go out for a vote, that you're gonna shed 10% of the support. Does that track with why pollsters like yourself are looking for support level north of 60%? Could you expand on that, please?
There are plenty of times in my work that I've seen support increase from a poll to the final result. But it's just as a general observation, this isn't particular to this bond measure or the city of Eugene, just generally speaking, it is easier to convince somebody to be against something than it is to move someone to be supportive of something. To the extent that opposition's campaigns emerge in any measure, they have, their task is easier. And so as you sort of think about where support could ultimately end up, conservative consultants want to be north of 50% and sort of give that guidance. And that 60% rule is a sort of rule of thumb. It's not magic by any stretch, but it's easier to convince somebody to be against something that is supportive of something. And if you think about where movement might be if there's an opposition campaign, that's sort of where that thinking comes from.
Okay, thank you. This next question, it might be better suited for our legal team and or Public Works. If 53% of the voters prioritize our response to the unhoused or homeless crisis, and only 1% put repairing roads and street repair as their top priority, can we, as a body and with this bond, use dollars to address areas of town where streets might be in disrepair or in need of cleaning, or any sort of repair because of an unhoused encampment has possibly denigrated the roadway?
The list of street preservation work is what is on the list, and you are limited to that work. If there is a cross between a project that's identified on the list and that also has some of those other attributes, then you can use bond money to do the street preservation work. I mean, that is the whole point of what the list is saying. These are the projects we're going to do, and you're limited to that.
Okay, that's helpful. So when we have this proposed potential list, and Councilor Zelenka is calling for a dollar amount attached to the projects, which I respect and applaud, is it possible to also ask then, and this might be a Matt Rodriguez question, for Public Works to identify or qualify which of the projects might be in relation to a response to an unhoused encampment?
So Councilor Keating, there's no damage to streets that I know of from unhoused use that would put them into a priority for pavement preservation. I want to be really clear about that. And the other thing with the bond is it can't be used for maintenance activities. It has to be for capital investment. So cleaning and things like that are not bond eligible expenses.
Okay, that's helpful. I will wait for a motion, Mayor. And as I indicated earlier, I may very well do a substitute for fall of 2023.
Very, very quickly, I just want to say, because it might be helpful, one of the reasons that we put the bond out earlier than absolutely needed is because we have a 3-year cycle typically, of which we're working with our partners to plan a project, and waiting till 23 would significantly change that window, and also our staffing forecasting if it didn't pass.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, Claire.
Thank you. So I really appreciate Mike getting the clarification from the city attorney about the implications. That was really helpful to me. So in that case, then we are saying that, staff is committed to creating a list at some point. So then that just means it has to happen after the election result in order to avoid that appearance.
That would be my recommendation.
Yeah. Okay. So I get that. So by staff going to our active transportation committee and discussing potential lists, that could be interpreted as staff advocating for specific projects in order to help pass the bond.
It puts them in a really tough spot to get that feedback and have all those discussions. Yes.
That's super duper helpful. So Catherine, if we want to ensure that there is some language that lets the public know there will be a process for creating that bike ped list, should the measure passed, do we need to include that language now, or can we add it at our July meeting that's been referenced?
Well, we can certainly, your motion that you have, so we haven't drafted the resolution, we've shelled it out, but so we can include language based on what we're hearing today.
Okay.
We can include language in there that tries to provide that type of specificity that you're looking for, just about that we are going to be working on this. There will be a process in here. There will ultimately be a list. We can include that in the resolution.
Okay, so because I just drafted, staff will develop a list of specific bike pedestrian projects with input from our Active Transportation Committee, Vision Zero Advisory Committee, and guidance from our TSP and CAP, as well as other stakeholders. This will not be an exhaustive list of these projects. So.
Yeah, and we'll
just for your consideration.
Thank you. Yeah, that's and we will probably want to include some recitals, and also probably have it in the now where they're 4 o'clock, because the resolution as a whole gets published in the voters pamphlet, so it's the opportunity to kind of tell the story of what you're hoping to do. So we'll work that in there for sure.
Okay, that's great. And the debate on making pedestrians pay their fair share will have to wait for another day. You meant bikes. I know. You said bike, Ted. I'm just teasing you. Thanks, Mayor.
Okay, well, Claire, I think you're still up because you need to put a motion on the table.
Gotcha. All right. Direct the city manager to bring back for council's consideration a resolution for placing a $61.2 million GO bond measure on the November 2022 ballot to fund capital pavement preservation, walking projects, biking projects, safety projects, and street tree projects, and that dedicates $3 million of those bond funds per year, $15 million, parenthetically, to walking, biking, safety, and street tree projects, and thereby dedicates the remaining $46.2 million to capital pavement preservation and bond issuance costs.
Second.
Okay, and I see Matt has his hand raised, so go for it, Matt.
Move to substitute November 2022 for November 2023.
Is there anyone to second that?
Fair enough. Withdrawn.
There we go. Okay, thank you. With that, any other questions or comments before we go for a vote? All right, all in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Got it. That passes unanimously. Thank you all very much. Thank you for just extending the meeting so that we could finish important business, and appreciate all the presentations. And we are adjourned.